Hello, everyone, and you are most welcome. My name is Mark Massa, and I have the privilege of being the director of the Boisi Center for Religion and American Public Life at Boston College. The Boisi Center is really honored to have the two stars of the field of the social scientific study of religion with us today. The title of this event is How Secularization Impact Religion, but I have a feeling, in fact, I know we're going to be talking about much more than secularization. So welcome, and you'll have a chance to write questions to us that the participants will answer. Nancy Ammerman is faculty emerita at the Boston University School of Theology. She is, of course, a very well-known and respected sociologist of religion. Her research began with an exploration of fundamentalism, and eventually focused on everyday, what we now call lived religion, across a wide religious and geographic spectrum. She is, of course, a widely published scholar, her most recent book being Studying Lived Religion, Contexts and Practices, which was published by New York University Press. José Casanova is a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, as well as professor emeritus of sociology and theology at Georgetown University. He is also widely published, including books including Public Religions in the Modern World, which has become something of a modern classic, as well as The Jesuits and Globalization, and Global Religions and Secular Dynamics. So welcome to you both, Nancy and Jose. Before we get to the whole secularization business, I thought we'd begin with maybe a little bio. I'm a historian of religion, so I always go to history. Tell me how your social scientific study of religion evolved from the beginning of your career until now, and how has your understanding of what religion is and secularism is changed over that course? Nancy, you want to start?
Sure. I often tell people that my career as a sociologist of religion started by being a pastor's kid. And
PK, okay.
Having to observe the congregations that my father moved from over the course of my growing up and figuring out what the culture of each one was and how to fit in. But when my earliest professional study of the sociology of religion in graduate school moved toward, as you mentioned, the study of fundamentalism. And in studying fundamentalism, I was really concerned with both individual beliefs and organizations, congregations, and sort of the organizational infrastructure that made it possible for people to be fundamentalists, and really thought about that in the context of a group of people that doesn't much like the secular world around them, and organizes a religious community and a religious set of beliefs that allows them to resist that secular world around them. I've spent a lot of my career looking at that sort of organizational level of how religion is practiced, but also looking at how individuals make a way to create spaces, times, places where they encounter a secular, or either the secular or the sacred presence. And I think that's one of the things we'll probably be talking about, is how those two things are always being defined, in effect, in relation to each other. You really can't talk about one without talking about the other.
Great, thank you. Jose, how would you describe the arc of your career?
Well, I grew up in Catholic Spain under the Franco regime, which was a very unique form of religion. So what was religion for me was very clear. And then I was fortunate to leave to study theology in Innsbruck. And this was, of course, a big shock for me. This was the late 60s, when theology was talking of the death of God, the secular city. So I took it for granted. I took the thesis of secularization for granted. Not only before I studied sociology, I knew the secularization thesis. Then I came to study sociology to the United States, and this was a shock for me. Like every other European visitor, was surprised of the religious vitality of the United States. And I knew all the previous Europeans, from Tocqueville to Weber, But somehow the story was America was the exception to the European rule. And I didn't find this explanation convincing. But it was not easy. It took me many, many years to figure out what was going on, because it was a contradiction. A modern society that is religious, so it's an exception until you no, it's not exception. You can be actually, it's a different form of modernity, precisely through different form of religion. And so finally, this is what led then to my comparative studies of, I guess I've been comparing, I've been an American in Europe, a European and a European in the United States, trying to help both sides, I thought, to understand how different these two systems are. And yet it came a moment it was not sufficient to focus on these two. And I became much more interested in globalization and the way the secular religious divide, which originally was a purely Christian theological divide, how has become globalized now in every country in the world, draws a distinction, but draws it differently in different ways. And the question is, who draws the distinction? Whether the people, religious authorities, the courts. So this is the interesting question, comparatively.
Okay, I'm gonna throw you both into the deep end of the pool, because you basically built the deep end of the pool. Secularization is one of those weasel words, that everybody uses, and they mean something different. But both of you have written very smart things on this. It seems to me that part of the theory of secularization depends on how you define religion, and it seems to me that an Enlightenment understanding of reason is basic to that. So I guess I would like to hear you talk about how much has religion and religious society been secularized or not, and what does point of view have to do with your answer to that? So Nancy, why don't you start?
Well, I tend to shy away from the term secularization, partly because it implies this process. It implies that once the world was this way and now it's going to be this way, and there's this kind of uniform direction, everybody's going to follow the same path. Obviously that's not the case. And, Jose has already pointed to the fact that there are these distinctions between secular and sacred that are everywhere, but it depends enormously on the context where those distinctions, where those lines are drawn. It depends on the legal context. It depends on the kind of religio-cultural context. Where do people expect religion to occur, and where don't they expect it to occur? And once you take that kind of context into account, then you can begin to ask questions about where and under what conditions it is more and less likely that people will perceive the sacred to be something that is relevant to their lives, where they will perceive that it is possible for them to engage in religious practices, where they perceive that it's possible to organize in religious ways, and so forth. And all of those things, those processes at the individual level, at the organizational level, and at the larger sort of societal cultural level, can go both ways in terms of more and less religious presence, more and less secular presence, more and less freedom to practice, more and less constraint by either the norms or the laws or the expectations on that practice.
Interesting. Jose, do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, we could spend weeks discussing secularization and we would not agree. And our master, the one who taught us everything about this, David Martin, wrote in the 60s, let's get rid of the very term secularization because it is so contradictory, so full of meanings, it doesn't make sense analytically. And then he wrote a general theory of secularization. He wrote about 2-3 different books about revisiting secularization. So he couldn't do, so it's a term that basically means all kinds of things and is totally, if you wish, hopeless, and yet we cannot do without it. What I would say concerning what you said about the Enlightenment critique of religion, that indeed it is it's no, if you wish, by chance that the most important revisions to the theory have been done by sociologists who take religion seriously. I mean, David Martin, myself, Nancy, basically everybody, Peter Berger, everybody who has done serious work on it, basically themselves are somehow religious persons. And or Hans Joas today, or Charles Taylor for that matter, right? So indeed, one has to get rid of the secularist enlightenment before one can begin taking seriously the study of religion.
My mentor in graduate school, I wrote my area is American religion. My mentor in graduate school always said that the degree of religion in American culture at any given time is always the same. It just manifests itself in different ways and in different impulses. Nancy, do you want to comment on that? Would you agree?
Yeah, not necessarily. I think one of the conundrums theoretically is whether you think there is a kind of human religious impulse that is going to be there no matter what. And, somehow it's going to leak out, no matter what the larger society does, and it'll just sort of, morph into different forms. I think that's a philosophical position that a sociologist like me isn't entirely, ready to jump into that position. Yeah. So I think it is possible to talk about religion having more and less presence and influence in a society, in American society, or in any other society from one time to another. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll toss it to Jose.
I also would disagree in the sense that we know even historically in the US, at the time of independence, most people were unchurched. They later became church, and today, of course, many of them are becoming unchurched again. So the question is, of course, if you take religion to go to church and to believe in, whatever churches say, then of course, there are fundamental differences. The other question, of course, in anthropological question, I would tend to agree with those people like Charles Taylor and Hans Joas who argue that what modernity does is religion becomes an option. Well, before there wasn't an option, it was simply something taken for granted. Now, to be secular, to be religious is an option. And this is what is new. And it's option also in the US, as we know from youth today, from the new generations, that is becoming more and more an option. Not because finally we are more secular than more modern than they were, than we were before, that finally the US is becoming modern, as our hard secularist or hard secularization theories would say. Finally, the US is becoming modern. No, because simply people react to the role of the churches in religious politics or politicized religion. And so they simply want to get out of this institutional religion. Now, of course, the question is, most people in the US would say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. So again, it's a way of saying I'm religious, but not truly religious. While in Europe, very few people say that. I'm secular or religious. So again, when you are not religious, what are you? Is very different in the US and in Europe.
Well, since you brought up Peter Berger's name, many decades ago, Peter Berger wrote a very important book called The Sacred Canopy, and he argued that all modern pluralist societies, which are made up of many people who from many different faiths, that all those societies have to separate religion from culture. They have to, actually what he said was, they have to privatize religion in order to keep the culture safe from religious wars. So Berger's argument was it's not at all surprising that pluralist societies like the United States and countries in Western Europe have privatized religion, which is a form of secularization in Peter Berger's sense, because in order to keep the religious peace. Would you agree with that, Nancy, or not?
I'm going to toss that one to Jose because that is directly in his wheelhouse.
Okay.
No, I've had many discussions with Peter Berger on this. I think that he's partly right, but ultimately wrong, in the sense that, yes, separation of religion and culture, yes, this is precisely what is new. This is what modern religion is. Something which is not entire culture, and it's not the religion of the Greeks, the religion of the Navajos, the religion, but they are specific religions, and people individually either follow them or not. And this is what is, of course, you could say these religions emerge in before the BC, let's say in the so-called age, but only with modernity really this has happened. Now, his thesis that actually the Westphalia led to privatization of religion is not true. The wars of religion were not stopped because people became secularized. It started because actually the Leviathan, the cuius regio ius religio, enforced confessionalization on everybody. That's why the sects, the religious dissenters had to leave those countries. So in Europe, it was generalized. You have a Protestant north, a Catholic south, and 3 biconfessional societies in between. And then all those societies became radically secularized. In other places, developments have been very, very different.
Interesting.
And I would just add that I think one of the things that we often say about the modern impact on religion is that it has to do with the Enlightenment and rationalization, and that it doesn't make sense to believe these things anymore. And at least in the US, all our data make us believe that it's really, when people leave religious traditions, no longer say, I'm a practicing Catholic or whatever. It is not about belief. It is about identification and belonging. It is about their rejection of a particular community or tradition, but not their rejection of beliefs in God or belief in general. I mean, even the most secular people are really not all that rational, frankly. And so when we think about people using science over religion, or whatever the sort of dichotomy is that people tend to set up, that's just not what shows up in terms of, for instance, people with higher education are more likely to identify with a religious tradition than people with lower levels of education. And that shows up it's really a social class effect and a belonging effect that, people who feel themselves to be part of America's mainstream society are more likely to also identify with a religious tradition and belong to a religious community. People who are left out and at the bottom, they're left out.
Interesting.
I would agree. And actually, I would say that the people that reject some particular religion explicitly is usually for moral reasons, not for cognitive reasons. On the other hand, once you have, if you wish, the rationalist Enlightenment worldview becomes hegemonic, then of course people may be born into it and take for granted that religion is nonsense. This is what happens in Europe, right? In Europe, indeed, most people believe that the religion is simply not compatible with modernity. But this is not because they themselves were religious and rejected it, but because they have accepted they taken for granted secular ideas in the country. But in America, we see that basically young people rejecting religion is a moral argument they do, not a cognitive argument, or moral political in the sense of moral political argument, right?
So that's interesting. Also, it's sort of part of the position on secularization depends on that basic distinction between public and private. That religion somehow is public, and people who reject that for a private thing are being quote unquote secularized. Would you agree that the public-private split, Nancy, is basic to this?
Well, I think the term private and privatization is problematic because I think our earlier conversation is right in that choice is really key here. And so to the extent that people perceive themselves to have a choice and can exercise choice relative to their religious beliefs, that we could call that secularization, but if they're choosing to be religious, that's not secularization. Even to say that they have individually chosen is not necessarily to say that their religion is private, because the religion they have chosen is likely itself embodied in a publicly accessible religious community a tradition that may have a very clear public presence. So those lines between public and private, I think, are problematic.
Jose, do you want to comment?
Of course, this was the core of my thesis, namely Habermas' thesis of the public sphere presupposes precisely private citizens. Only because precisely modernity protects privacy, then private citizens have the right to go into the public. Without protection of private citizens, you will not have public citizens. So privacy is fundamental, is a fundamental condition for public engagement. The same goes for religion. A privatized religion is a fundamental condition for religion to have the right to enter the public sphere. And this was my argument. So it's not that modernity leads to privatization. Yes, privatization because the individuals have to have the right to religious freedom, which I wouldn't call it choice in the purely market sense of making, if you use market choices. That's why the option thing, the option, which is existential options, is a better term than the choice in the purely individualist sense of the term. But yes, so yes, religions need to be private before they can be public in the modern sense. Otherwise, they are not public in the modern sense. They are simply officially enforced from above as public religions.
That's interesting. So I'm going to put you far out on the limb here. So would you basically agree with Charles Taylor's argument in The Secular Age then that it's making religion a choice among other choices that leads to the perception among some that there's been a secularization of society? Or do you think his basic take on that was mistaken or too simplistic?
Well, I think it is a choice among choices. But I don't think that necessarily should be labeled secularization.
Interesting.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. Jose, would you agree?
I mean, I know the book. I mean, he wrote the book when we were together in Berlin with Hans Joas, the three of us, a whole year together, and obviously we had a lot of conversations. I fundamentally agree with Charles' thesis in general. He had added something about taking for granted conditions for unbelief, belief, and unbelief. This is what the book is all about. What makes it possible for people to have the, if you wish, the possibilities of unbelief. Now, of course, you always have unbelieving individuals, but the whole society can become unbelieving. And what are the conditions for it? In this respect, this is what is fundamentally new, that modernity creates the conditions, the immanent frame of secularity creates the conditions in which to be believer or not believer is open to an existential option. And of course, these options are then multiplied, as he puts it, is, you know, basically to the higher degree. So my problem with his thesis that is too Western-centric and too Atlantic is basically based on the Anglo, and not even the US. The US doesn't really fully enter his analysis well. It's a very Canadian, I mean, Quebecois, French, let's say Anglo-Quebecois analysis, because the Quebecois became all secular and he is an Anglo-Catholic, maintained his identity, but he's very close to the French model. So yeah, I mean, I obviously I'm very close to Charles and the thesis, but I think that, and of course he accepts these limitations, that it is basically, it doesn't work for Latin America, for instance, Latin American modernity very well, but it works for the Anglo-Atlantic, French, basically Western Europe and the North Atlantic, it works.
Okay, so would the two of you argue that the situation for religion and public culture in the United States is basically different from that of Western Europe, or basically the same as that of Western Europe? What would you say?
I think it's quite different. Partly because we do not have a heritage of an established religion. And throughout Western Europe, there is this culture that is the culture itself is actually saturated with the historical religious presence of these established religions. Even if not a single person goes to church or believes anything, you know, they're still going to have these, you know, religious holidays that are on the calendar and, you know, religious ways or religious institutions that maintain the cemeteries and the birth records and so forth. So, there's a kind of a different kind of religious public presence in Western European society.
Largely because of material culture, would you say?
Well, material culture and the calendar and the residues of the links between church and state. I mean, people in Sweden don't have to pay their church taxes anymore, but the majority of them still do because they get some civic good out of the payments that go through the government to the churches. So, there is this connection, this interweaving of church life and civic life that, while it's nowhere near as strong as it was a century ago, it's still present. And, to a certain extent, people might argue that there's some of that in the US as well. Our presidents can't seem to end a speech without saying, God bless you and God bless America. But we don't have that heritage of an established church that helped to set the laws and set the calendar and so forth. So the presence that religious communities have in the US is a presence that has to be organized in a, one might say, a private sphere. It has to be organized from outside the structures of the state itself.
So, as you began by describing yourself as being a product of Franco Spain. So would you agree with Nancy that the United States is unique?
This is the fundamental difference, but already Karl Marx, following Tocqueville, saw it very clearly. And the Jewish question, he says, the United States is the perfect land of disestablishment, or the model disestablishment, so the wall of separation of church and state, and yet is the land of religiosity par excellence, and a religiosity which is always linked to the public sphere in politics. So wall of separation of church and state, but no separation of religion and politics. Right. In Europe, it goes both ways in the sense that they separate either you have full fusion of the two, and then the Franco regime, or you have radical separation, and then you try to privatize religion. And so it's always much more difficult to accept, because, and the fundamental difference, every European country still today have national churches, with the exception, I would say, of Ukraine. Ukraine is the only country today that has followed the American denominational model. It's the model of religious pluralism with competing churches, and therefore, when you have competing national churches, you have no church anymore, as Weber would say, you have denominations. But in Europe, you have church and then sects. And here we have neither churches nor sects. Sects were the majority of them, and then they became denominations. Right. And even the churches had to become denominations.
Right. So that's something I always try to impress on my students, that famous Proustian distinction between church and sects really doesn't apply to the United States. That because we don't have established churches, we have voluntary groups called denominations, which makes it somewhat different and harder to press. I have a question from somebody who's listening and watching us. Is the rise of the nuns, that is, young people who say, I'm spiritual but not religious, what is the relationship of that thing, the famous spiritual but not religious kind of thing? What's the relationship of that to secularization or privatization, or is there any relationship between those things? What do you think? The famous, Christian Smith in his book Soul Searching talks about most teenagers in the United States belong to the Church of Moralistic Therapeutic Deism, which is an independent church. Nancy, what do you think?
Yeah, I think first of all, we need to distinguish between the nuns, which encompasses anybody who doesn't find a traditional religious label that they're willing to give themselves. So are you Protestant, Catholic, Jewish? No, none of the above. Within that overall umbrella are very different groups. The most clearly non-religious are the people who identify as atheist and who are very clear that they're not religious, they don't believe in God, they don't go to church. I mean, none of the markers of any kind of personal religiosity, and often actually have quite an animus toward religion and religious people. Agnostics are pretty close to the atheists, actually, but both of those together are actually only about a third of all of the nuns. Right. In fact, even probably smaller than that. The large majority of the nuns are what the Pew Research Center calls nothing in particulars. And, you know, they're not particularly religious. In the usual sense of those terms, but most of them do believe in God. They do show up in their place of worship once in a while. They're not particularly antagonistic toward religious traditions. They often say they think religious institutions are good for society. So it's just a very different group. Somewhere within that group, you get the people you've been talking about as the spiritual but not religious. And in fact, a whole lot of people who aren't nuns would call themselves spiritual but not religious. So that's kind of a separate phenomenon, if you will, but both are influenced by the fact that organized religion has gotten a pretty bad name in the last 3 decades. Maybe for longer than that, but particularly with the political rise of the religious right. You see in the 1990s this very visible political presence that is identified as these are the religious people, you know, who are trying to influence society in certain ways. And a lot of folks who are kind of on the margins of their religious traditions anyway, not for the most part really deeply embedded in those traditions, kind of looked out at the landscape and said, if Jerry Falwell is what it means to be religious, I want no part of it. But hey, I'm still a nice person. I'm still a good person. I still have morals. So, you know, if I'm going to be non-religious, I've got to have an identity that somehow says to people, I'm not one of those amoral, terrible people. And so spiritual comes to be the way to describe, I have some kind of moral or spiritual core, but I'm not identifying with a religious tradition, even if I really am a Catholic or a Jew or, you know, Lutheran.
Interesting. Jose, what do you think?
Well, you know, there is this Peter van der Veer, who is probably a leading anthropologist of religion, working originally in India and then India and China. In his book, Comparing China and India, actually has a tetralogy of terms that we need to take into account if we want to understand the religious field. And this is religion and secular, but also magic and religion and spirituality. Because of course, for Durkheim, the key division was between religion and magic, right? Religion, which is public, magic, which is private. But of course, there is a distinction between spiritual and materialism, and all those who don't want to be atheists, they think there is something beyond, if you wish, the material in this life. They are spiritual, not religious, but they don't want to have anything to do with institutional religion. Obviously, a lot of the tradition, mystical traditions in the East will be of this kind, right? So, and then of course you have the religion secular, and before it was made a decision profane, sacred and profane, which is very different. I never would use sacred and secular, because the sacred can be the secular, what the competition today is between the sacred secular and the religious sacred. This is the real competition for the Durkheim sense that the state, human rights, citizenship, this is sacred, the nation is sacred, and yet it's not religion or not transcendent. So again, we have to be very careful how all these categories are used in different contexts.
Interesting. Well, I have a question from somebody at the University of London who might get the award for the questioner from furthest away. Here's what this person writes. What about family transmission? My recent research with ex-Anglican baby boomers concludes a striking variable in declining mainstream Christianity is family transmission. The baby boomers raised by their Gen X or millennial children tend to be non-religious. The change is therefore generational. Young people today, the nuns, didn't just turn away from the church. Most never had it in the first place. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's actually what the research is showing. I pointed to the political issue earlier in the drop-off in the 90s, but what we also see is a generational shift. And the people who are most likely to identify as nuns increasingly had no religious upbringing. So, if you looked at the 1990s and the surveys then, and most of the people who were beginning to identify as not having a religious identity were raised in some kind of religious tradition. It may have been quite marginal in terms of their actual immersion in the tradition, but they had that. If you think about those people who were raised in the 1990s and already are being raised in households that have no religious affiliation, then what we see today are their children who are nuns by birth.
Interesting. Jose, you agree?
Yes, and this is why secularization in Europe is basically irreversible, because you have many different generations accumulating. I mean, there was the famous book, The Death of Christian Britain, which basically argued that it has happened because of the gender revolution of the 60s. It is female secularization that basically is the end of family transmission. Before, when the intelligentsia, male intelligentsia secularized with the Enlightenment, women remain. When the bourgeoisie secularized, women remain. When the working class secularized, women remain. Even Enrico Berlinguer, the secretary of the Communist Party in Italy, accompanied his wife every Sunday to church. He did not enter the church, but his wife went to church every Sunday and he will accompany her. So his children went to church. But when women don't go to church, children don't go to church anymore. And this has happened in Europe now for 100 years. And so, yes, this is, of course, family transmission is the key.
Great.
In Europe, without grandmothers, there is no religion.
Okay. I have a question from another person about the relationship of pluralism and choices that we have to secularization. If there is a link between pluralism and various social circumstances and the choice that offers, and therefore the decline of religion, why do we witness reducing pluralism in many societies today? Is rising pluralism and choice still the main framework for understanding the role of religion and religion's role to secularization, or not? Or is that changing, would you say?
I'm uncertain about the premise that there's reducing pluralism in some societies. I don't know, Jose, do you have?
Well, this was my main disagreement with Peter Berger. He assumed that modernity brings pluralism, not only secular religious pluralism, but also religious pluralism. And the European experience was that modernization does not bring religious pluralism to Europe until now the immigrants had brought. So the attempts, and that's why the thesis of the supply side theory didn't work in Europe, because you had basically entrepreneurs bringing religion, but there was no demand for religion. So in this respect, the European model was based on homogeneization. First, confessional homogeneization, and later secular homogeneization. This is not anymore the case. Now in Europe also you have increasing religious pluralism, although secular options are still the majority options. So I also disagree with the notion that the religious options are being reduced, pluralism is being reduced. On the contrary, pluralism, I would say, is growing everywhere, even within societies that were homogeneous, like within Islam or certainly within Catholic societies, we see it through Latin America, right? So they become very, very deeply pluralistic societies.
Certainly there are places where there are attempts at the state level to reduce the levels of pluralism. I heard a really interesting commentary about the situation in Ukraine and what the two options look like if Russia wins or if Ukrainians manage to maintain their independence. That Ukraine has been a very pluralistic, religiously plural society, not just with multiple Orthodox options, but with lots of other religious options as well. And those have been quite tolerated. But the Russian example is one in which the religious options are actually narrowed and actually became narrowed in the post communist period from an initial kind of openness out to more religious options, to more and more instantiating the Russian Orthodox Church as the church and the only legitimate one.
Interesting.
Yeah, I fully agree on this. I've written a lot on this and I published a lot of things. Obviously, with the second presidency of Putin and the alliance of the Moscow Patriarchate and the state, what you have is now basically a division of three types of religions. The national religion of Russia, which is of course Orthodox, although only 70% of the population are Orthodox within the Russian Federation. Then, of course, the traditional religions of the Imperial Russia, which are the Buddhists, the Muslims, the Jews, the other ethnic groups, but those are considered ethnic religions. And then the new religions, which are those precisely which individuals choose. And these are the ones which are not accepted. So you basically have ethno-religious classification of people, and the state does not allow basically people to change. Orthodox cannot leave their religion, so automatically they are always Orthodox, and the others also are ethno-religious. So in this respect, yes, there's a fundamental difference between Russia and Ukraine.
Interesting. I have an interesting theoretical question from someone, and that is, this is the question. In case the secularization paradigm is true, what would be, in your opinion, the final outcome for Western societies?
Well, if the secularization paradigm were true, Western societies would all become uniformly non-believing and divorced from any kind of religious participation or institution. All of our social needs and organizing would take place through non-religious means. What else, Jose?
Well, I mean, this, of course, there has been a lot of discussion about the Scandinavian societies, which happen to be very secular, but are very, very moral. I always say the Scandinavian societies are not religious, but are very Christian. American society is very religious, but very un-Christian. So again, what you will have is basically different forms of humanitarian morality. So there is no evidence that secularization lead to a decadence of morality or whatever. So this is very important, because when people argue we need religion to have morality, is nonsense. A lot of religious people are immoral, a lot of non-religious people are very moral. So we don't know really, but it's a possibility. There's the argument. Especially Hans Joas has worked on this probably more systematically. His book Faith as Option is basically around this.
Another question from another viewer is it true that secularism is itself a religion? That is, a set of values that binds one's life together in the true sense of the word, or not? Is secularization itself a religion?
Not
secularization.
I've written a lot about secularism.
Okay, I'm sorry, I misspoke that. Is secularism a religion?
Well, it can be a world ideology, especially if it is a philosophy of history. It tells you that religion is going to disappear, and therefore you better go with history and you better leave religion behind, because otherwise you are basically a primitive person, right? A traditional. So you cannot be a modern religion. So if you have this ideology, yes, it's of course not a religion, but an ideology. On the other hand, there is secularism as a political statecraft to separate religion and state, which actually is basically a fundamental fact of global developments. And this type of secularism is not necessarily an ideology, it's simply a condition of possibility for religious pluralism. Because without this separation, you cannot have religious pluralism. Only when the state doesn't take side with any particular religion can protect the other religion. So in this respect, we need secular states to have religious pluralism and to have options. So, and this is the kind of secularism which is, if you wish, helpful for individual freedoms.
Now, here's an interesting little twist on that question. There are secular worshiping communities, if you will. There are Sunday Assembly is one of these groups of people who want the benefits that they see in a religious community without the religion. Right. So they want the moral teaching. They want the enthusiastic group sort of membership and experience. They want the Durkheimian effervescence.
They want Sunday school.
They want a place for their kids to learn to be good people. So far, it doesn't seem to me that these sort of organized secular communities have caught on particularly well. But there certainly are lots of experiments of people attempting to sort of put together a substitute that is a secular substitute.
And of course, it's a very, very American. I mean,
there are Sunday assemblies in Europe.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, there are, but as a phenomenon, secular humanism to be organized is a British phenomenon. Secular humanism was not organized as a movement, let's say, in continental Europe. Today, perhaps it may become organized, but and of course you had groups of non ethical societies, all kinds of ethical societies you've had throughout, and basically also anti-clerical, basically radical, from anarchists to Republicans that understood themselves as alternatives to religion, as communities of moral and precisely in the Durkheimian sense, right?
We have time for one last question. Here goes. It has been frequently mentioned that the experience of secularity in the Muslim world today is likely to be different from the European American context. Any thoughts on how secularization in the Muslim context might interplay with what is going on in the West, or will it be something different?
Well, even the West is very different, as I pointed out. Europe and the US are very different. So you can expect, if this is the case, India is very different, right? And China is very different, and the Muslim world is very different. But within the Muslim world, there are crucial difference between Indonesia, Senegal, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, etc. So we cannot talk of a Muslim the same way you have within the West very different patterns, even within Protestantism, within Catholicism, within Orthodoxy. So you are going to have different patterns within Islam. But in general, you can say what has happened is that Islam has been hijacked by the state. So the kind of confessionalization. So you have everywhere state Islam. And so everything is Islam. So the state is Islam, but the dissident second state is Islam. So it appears that Islam is so politicized, but Islam is politicized because the state has taken over and is state Islam. So it's only, again, the sects, the groups like in Senegal, the Murids that say, we don't want to have the state telling us how to be good Muslims, and therefore we are for laïcité, but laïcité bien entendue, right? So we want to have secular states or secularism, but a well-understood secularism. So yes, it's very different.
Jose, a question for you. I'm thinking about France,
right,
and the way in which, because of the state-church relationship, in order for France to have its revolution, people rebelled not just against the monarchy, but against the church. And that tie between being a good, pluralist, democratic person and being a religious person was like that was not possible. anti-clericalism and democratic sentiments went hand in hand. Might there be a parallel for people in Muslim countries where the state has become so much entwined with what it means to be Muslim, that in order to, that if there are democratic movements in those societies, they're likely also to be anti-clerical kinds of movements?
This is what I basically predicted when I got an interview by the Iranian dissidents movement. I said, well, this is what happened to Franco. If you have national Catholicism enforced by the state, after the regime, you are going to have people leaving the church as fast as they can and going to court and forcing the Catholic Church to take their names out of the baptistry registration because I was not baptized freely. I was. So yes. So when the church responded, no, once baptized, baptized forever, they went to court to make sure their names were taken out of the. So yes, it will happen. It will happen.
Nancy and Jose, you are universally considered stars, and that's because you are. So, and our conversation today has proven that beyond a shadow of a doubt. Thanks to both of you for your time and the very intelligent conversation. Thanks to our viewers. Thanks for the very smart questions that were asked. This will be posted at the Boisi Center website, so you're welcome to go back and view it at more leisure. Thank you all, and Nancy and Jose, you'll be invited back. Trust me on this one. So thank you. Take care.